3 small coffins rested side by side in the morning frost, though the girls inside weren't dead. The sound of fingernails scratching against pine wood echoed across Bramble Hollow as the sun climbed over the ridge, while the smell of wood smoke mixed with something darker, something wrong, drifting from the Ashbourne cabin. This is the story of Essie, Bessie, and DeCessie Ashbourne, triplets born in the mountains of West Virginia in 1836, whose silence spoke louder than any cry ever could. The Appalachian Mountains have always held secrets within their hollows and slopes, where communities were so isolated that family lines twisted like mountain laurel, and justice answered not to any courthouse, but to the one carved from fear and custom. Bramble Hollow was no exception, a settlement of maybe 40 souls scattered across the mountains, connected by deer paths and an unspoken agreement that some things were better left unmentioned. The Ashbourne family lived at the center of it all, in a cabin that had sheltered 3 generations of mountain folk who minded their own business and expected others to do the same. Mortimer Ashbourne tended the hillside as his father had before him, coaxing corn and beans from soil that was more stone than dirt. His wife, Helena Bramblecroft Ashbourne, came from sturdy mountain stock, a woman who could birth a calf, cure a ham, and sing old ballads to keep the spirits of the mountains at bay. When Helena went into labor in the bitter winter of 1836, the midwife Marcella Wesley climbed through snow nearly knee-deep to assist, expecting 1 child, maybe 2, if the Lord chose to bless the Ashbournes. Nobody expected 3. The triplets were born on the longest night of the year, as the mountain wind howled like something hungry, shaking the cabin's single window in its frame. Marcella later told folks that in her 40 years of midwifery she had delivered hundreds of babies, but never had she seen newborns who didn't cry. Not once. Essie came first, then Bessie, then DeCessie. 3 identical girls with dark hair and eyes darker still, who stared at the world with an intensity that made grown men uneasy. "They watch everything," Marcella whispered to her husband that night, hands trembling as she recounted the birth, like taking notes. The girls grew in perfect unison, reaching each milestone on the same day, speaking their first words in unison, taking their first steps as if guided by some invisible hand. But unlike most children, who babbled, laughed, and filled homes with noise, the Ashbourne triplets remained unnervingly quiet, a fog of silence settling over the cabin. They communicated through looks and gestures, completing one another's thoughts before those thoughts became words. Neighbors noticed. Phineas Colebrook, whose land bordered the Ashbournes, mentioned to his wife seeing the girls standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods, watching him work the fields with faces that seemed far too old for children. "Gave me the creeps," he admitted over supper, "like they were studying me for something I wouldn't want to know." The girls aged, but the silence never broke. By 7, when the settlement's traveling preacher, Josiah Thornvale, came for his monthly visit, he found the triplets sitting in the front pew, hands folded, eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his prepared sermon falter. After the service, he pulled Mortimer aside. "Those girls of yours," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool air, "they haven't blinked once in the past hour." Mortimer shrugged the way mountain men do when pressed about family matters. "They're just quiet children, preacher. Ain't no law against that." Yet there were other things, small but unsettling, that the townsfolk noticed but never spoke of aloud. Animals vanished, first chickens, then larger livestock. Dogs and cats refused to enter the Ashbourne yard. Children from neighboring homes fell ill with sudden fevers after playing near the triplets. Fevers that vanished as quickly as they came, but left the children wary, as though they'd glimpsed something they could not recall. The triplets themselves remained untouched by common childhood ailments. They never caught the recurring mountain fevers, never scraped their knees or burned their fingers, never felt cold, even when frost etched the windows and other children huddled near fires. By their 15th year, the silence had become intentional, purposeful. The girls were tall, lean, moving with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. They dressed identically, spoke together when they spoke at all, and shared knowledge that excluded everyone else, including their parents. Helena aged quickly, her hair graying and hands trembling during Sunday services. Mortimer took to drinking corn whiskey in quantities that worried neighbors, though none dared speak up. The couple tried for more children, but Helena miscarried 3 times, each loss leaving her hollow-eyed and withdrawn. The mountains themselves seemed to respond to the girl's presence. Gardens near the Ashbourne cabin yielded stunted vegetables tasting faintly of ash. Wells that had run clear for generations produced water with a metallic tang that livestock refused. Old-timers muttered about curses and mountain spirits, though in 1854 such superstitions felt like relics of another age. Could 3 girls truly be responsible for the growing unease? The answer came with a harvest moon, when Bramble Holler learned that some hungers could only be satisfied with the taste of betrayal, and that blood runs thickest when spilled by family hands. But before the Ashbourne Triplets secured their place in Appalachian folklore, take a moment to reflect where you are and what time it is in your corner of the world. These stories bridge distance and time, reminding us that darkness finds us wherever we are. If this tale of mountain secrets and sisterly silence has drawn you in, mark it with a like or follow, for the true horror of Essie, Bessie, and DeCessie Ashbourne is only beginning. The morning Phineas Colebrook found his prized bull with its throat cut in a flawless line, the blood drained so completely that the grass beneath remained green. Coppery scent filled the air as frost crunched under his boots while he circled the carcass, searching for tracks that simply weren't there. This marked the beginning of Bramble Holler's descent into a darkness that would redefine mountain folks' understanding of evil. The incident happened on October 15, 1853, 3 weeks after the Ashbourne Triplets' 17th birthday. Phineas had owned the Hereford bull Caesar for 6 years, a beast that had fathered half the calves in the holler and had never feared man or beast. Yet something had approached Caesar in the pre-dawn hours, allowed close enough to slice his neck with surgical precision. Whatever did this knew exactly what it was doing, Phineas told a neighbor examining the wound. This ain't wildcats or wolves, this is butchery. But mountain butchers leave tracks. They take meat. This thing left nothing but blood. Nearly 800 pounds of prime beef lay to rot in the morning sun. The discovery sent a ripple of dread through the settlement. Livestock meant survival in Bramble Holler, where winter stretched from November to April, and the nearest town was 2 hard days away, through mountain passes blocked by snow. Predator losses were expected, but this was deliberate, almost ceremonial in its precision. Marcella Wesley, the midwife who had delivered the triplets 17 years prior, remembered the peculiarities of their birth. The girls had emerged silent, with a strange mark on their left shoulder, 3 interlocking circles etched in flesh. Helena had bled far less than usual during the triple birth. Blood calls to blood, her grandmother had always said. 2 days after Caesar's death, Widow Morrison's chickens were found in her yard, arranged in a perfect circle, eyes clouded white as frost. The widow, who had raised 8 children and buried 2 husbands, packed her belongings and moved in with her sister down the valley that very afternoon. Something's stirring in these mountains, she warned anyone who would listen. The Ashbourne Triplets attended Caesar's impromptu burial. The girls stood at the edge, identical in dark dresses, watching Phineas and 2 men struggle to drag the bull into a hastily dug pit. Essie smiled once, briefly, an expression of cold satisfaction that made the preacher Josiah Thornvale shiver. By evening, as families checked their doors and fires, the sound of singing drifted from the Ashbourne cabin. Three voices in perfect harmony, a melody unfamiliar yet bone-deep chilling. Blood remembers everything. Helena had been visiting her sister when Caesar died. Mortimer was away checking traps. Alibis seemed solid, yet in the mountains the accused could be everywhere at once. Old-timers recalled tales of mountain witches and blood curses, dismissed by day but given credence by night, as the triplets' singing echoed through the holler. Cherokee warnings about certain places, bloodlines, and insatiable hungers felt less like myth, more like prophecy. Dr. Edmund Fairfax, traveling the mountain circuit, arrived mid-October to a community gripped by fear it could not name. Patients described dreams of three figures standing at the foot of their beds, watching. Children had night terrors, screaming about the sisters who never blinked. Nursing mother's milk turned thin and bitter. Mass hysteria, he wrote, common in isolated areas. Social events might help. Yet his explanations faltered when his horse refused to approach the Ashbourne property, and his instruments chilled whenever the triplets appeared outside his cabin window. The rational world collapsed entirely on October 28th, when he was called to examine Martha Colebrook, Phineas's youngest daughter, discovered standing motionless in the barn, surrounded by cattle stirred nervously as her eyes rolled back, leaving only the whites visible. She had been missing for 2 days. She couldn't remember where she had been or how she had returned. She spoke in broken sentences about the sisters and the lessons she had learned, about learning to remain silent like them. The most alarming detail was the 3 small marks that had appeared on her left shoulder. They resembled the birthmarks the Ashbourne triplets had carried since the day they were born. Dr. Fairfax examined the marks through a magnifying glass borrowed from Josiah Thornvale's reading kit. What had seemed like simple bruises revealed themselves under magnification to be something far more intentional. 3 interlocking circles had been carved into her skin with surgical accuracy. The wounds were already beginning to heal in a way that would leave permanent scars. In a letter to a colleague in Charleston, the doctor wrote that these marks appeared to have been made with precise knowledge of human anatomy. Their depth and placement suggested either medical training or long practice on living subjects. Martha Colebrook had been claimed, marked, inducted into something adults couldn't understand, but felt in their bones. If one child could be taken, changed, taught, then others could follow. How many more children would it take before the triplets' true plan became clear? As November chills settled over Bramble Holler and the first snow dusted the ridgelines, the settlement would begin to see that Essie, Bessie, and Dessie Ashbourne were preparing for far more than simple intimidation. They were building an army, one child at a time, and their 18th birthday would mark not just their coming of age, but the start of a harvest that would scar the mountain for generations. Martha Colebrook had not spoken a single word in 3 days, but her silence carried a weight that pressed on every conversation in Bramble Holler, like storm clouds gathering over the ridge. The metallic taste of winter air carried something else, too, something that made mothers draw their children closer when the wind shifted from the direction of the Ashbourne cabin. The community faced a terrifying truth, more horrifying than any old mountain legend. Their children were disappearing, not dying, but being taken by something far more insidious. November brought early snow, blanketing the holler in a white so pure it made the dark windows of empty cabins look like hollow eye sockets. 3 more families packed their belongings and headed down to valley settlements, claiming work elsewhere but leaving behind livestock, furniture, and decades of roots in the mountains. Those who stayed did so either out of stubborn pride or because they understood something the departed had not. Running would not help when the danger existed within the children's dreams. Dr. Fairfax had set up a makeshift clinic in the settlement's single-room schoolhouse, treating what he described in his notes as collective nervous exhaustion with strange physical manifestations. 7 children now bore the 3 interlocking circles on their left shoulders. Each appeared under different circumstances, but the pattern remained. The child would vanish for a day or two, return with no memory of where they had been, and display a quiet stillness that mirrored the Ashbourne triplets' unnerving calm. From a medical perspective, Dr. Fairfax wrote to his mentor at Johns Hopkins that he was observing what seemed to be induced catatonia in minors, combined with deliberate scarification, using techniques suggesting anatomical knowledge beyond what one might expect in a rural area. What the doctor could not bring himself to document was how the marked children began gathering at the forest's edge each evening, standing perfectly still until frantic parents dragged them home, or how they started moving in unison, like dancers following music only they could hear. The marks were spreading. 10-year-old Samuel Thornville, the preacher's grandson, disappeared on November 8th while collecting firewood behind his family's cabin. 2 days later, his grandmother found him sitting in the church pew where the Ashbourne triplets usually sat. 3 fresh wounds were healing on his shoulder. His young face carried a look of adult calculation that made her weep. 8-year-old Rebecca Wesley vanished from her bed on November 13th. Her grandmother searched for 36 hours before finding the child standing waist-deep in the creek behind the Ashbourne property, her nightgown frozen to her skin, but her body warm. The marks were already there, already healing, already binding her to whatever covenant the triplets were constructing. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Each return brought the same changes. Each new marking added another voice to the silent chorus gathering at the settlement's edges, watching, waiting, learning. They were building something with the children. Mortimer Ashbourne had aged 20 years in a month. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold his morning coffee. Helena had taken to her bed, claiming illness, but really hiding from the neighbors' stares. Neither parent seemed capable of controlling their daughters, if they ever had. The triplets moved through the settlement like owners surveying their land, untouchable, fearless, gaining strength with every child they claimed. Phineas Colebrook organized the first community meeting on November 16th, gathering the remaining families in the schoolhouse after Dr. Fairfax finished his evening rounds. 23 adults crowded into a space meant for half that number, their breath fogging in the unheated room, while oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls lined with children's drawings. Innocent scenes of mountain life now seemed to mock the darkness, pressing in from all sides. "We know what's happening," Phineas said without preamble. "Question is, what are we going to do about it?" Josiah Thornville rose slowly, his preacher's training struggling against his grandfather's fear. "My Samuel won't speak to me anymore, won't look at me. He sits at the table like he's listening to voices I can't hear. That's not my grandson. That's something wearing his face." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Other parents shared similar observations. Children who no longer played or laughed, who watched their families with detached interest, as though studying specimens. The marked children still followed direct commands, still ate when fed, still slept in their own beds. But the spark that made them human seemed dimmed, redirected toward goals their parents couldn't understand. "We could leave," Mary Colebrook suggested, though her voice held no certainty. "Pack up, start fresh somewhere else." "And go where?" Phineas asked. "You think whatever claimed our children won't follow? Distance won't protect us from something that can reach into dreams." Dr. Fairfax cleared his throat, drawing attention to the corner where he had been taking notes. "I've been corresponding with colleagues about similar cases. There are instances of mass hysteria, shared delusions, epidemic psychosis in isolated communities. But the physical evidence, the scarring, synchronized behavior, hypnotic-like states, suggests something beyond normal psychological explanations." The adults stared, desperate for reason, for answers that could make sense of the transformation of their children. The doctor continued, and his clinical voice trembling slightly. I believe we are dealing with individuals who have developed advanced techniques of psychological manipulation, possibly learned from traveling mesmerists or medical practitioners. The Ashbourne girls may have gained knowledge of anatomy, medicine, even surgical skills, through sources we have not yet identified. You're saying they're just clever? Marcella Wesley asked, a note of hope in her voice. I'm saying they're human, he replied, which means they can be stopped. But even as he said it, he remembered his horse's terror, his instruments growing cold, and the dreams visiting him each night. 3 figures standing at the foot of his bed, beckoning him to join their silent congregation. Rational explanations felt thin, like mountain air, when confronted with the reality of what the triplets had become. Outside, snow fell harder, and the people inside felt the weight of unseen eyes. Through frost-covered windows, small shadows moved at the tree line, child-sized figures standing perfectly still despite the bitter wind. The marked children had come to watch. What would the adults decide? Would it matter, when their own children had already chosen sides? As November waned and the triplets' 18th birthday approached like a deadline written in blood and silence, Bramble Holler would learn that some battles are lost before they even begin, especially when the enemy wears the faces of the children you are trying to save. On November 23rd, the children stopped coming home, but their parents still saw them in perfect formation at the tree line, 13 small figures arranged like chess pieces, waiting for a game to begin. The sound of their synchronized breathing created a rhythm that seemed to match the wind itself, an unearthly, chilling cadence that left the adults frozen in place, hearts pounding as the shadows waited silently. The mountains seemed to have their own heartbeat. The smell of pine sap mixed with something metallic drifted through Bramble Holler on every evening breeze, and the struggle for the settlement's soul had shifted beyond individual families. This was now a war between those willing to act and those who had already surrendered their will. Dr. Fairfax recorded the mass departure in his clinical notes. November 23, 1853, 13 miners ages 8 to 14 did not return home after what parents described as evening walks. The children were observed holding positions roughly 200 yards northeast of the settlement center, unresponsive to parental calls or attempts to retrieve them physically. What the doctor couldn't convey in his precise language was the heartbreak of seeing Mary Colebrook collapse into the snow after her son Thomas turned away from her outstretched arms, choosing instead to join the silent gathering of marked children, or the way Josiah Thornville's voice cracked when his grandson Samuel looked through him as if he were invisible, already part of something larger than family, larger than love. The triplets had gathered their army. Now they were ready for war. Phineas Colebrook had exhausted both his patience and his faith in reason. On November 24th, he strapped on his father's old Navy Colt and walked through the settlement toward the Ashbourne cabin, his boots crunching in snow that had fallen steadily for 3 days. Behind him, 6 other men followed, armed with rifles and revolvers, fueled by desperation. "This ends tonight," he muttered as they neared the cabin. Through the frosted windows, the triplets could be seen seated around the kitchen table, hands folded, motionless like carved figures. The girls did not acknowledge the armed men surrounding their home. Not a blink, not a twitch. Mortimer Ashbourne met the men at the front door, his face hollow with exhaustion and something deeper, the realization that his daughters had surpassed his understanding or control. "Phineas," he said softly, "you know I cannot let you hurt them. They are still my children." Phineas's hand rested on his pistol. "Because the children I knew did not steal others' children and turn them into walking ghosts." The confrontation that followed would haunt survivors for decades. Helena Ashbourne emerged from the cabin, moving with the uncertain steps of someone who had felt Eldam's numbing embrace. Behind her, the triplets appeared, dressed alike in dark wool coats, faces as calm as Sunday churchgoers. "Good evening," Essie said, her voice ringing in the cold air. It was the first sound most men had heard from the triplets in years. "We have been expecting you." "Have you now?" Phineas replied, his grip tightening. "Then you know why we're here." "You're here because you have lost something." Bessie's voice followed seamlessly from her sister's. "And you think taking us back will restore it. But what you lost cannot be returned?" Essie finished, smiling without warmth, only acknowledging a game played to its inevitable end, because it was never truly yours. The men raised their weapons, but the triplets' synchronized response caused hesitation. The girls began humming the same haunting melody that had floated through the holler for months, and the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once: cabin walls, snow-laden trees, children at the forest edge, even the mountains themselves. Dr. Fairfax, who had joined the group despite his medical training favoring healing over harm, felt his rifle grow impossibly heavy. The humming was more than sound. It bypassed ears entirely and worked directly on the nervous system, paralyzing muscles from fingertips to shoulders, even those controlling breath. "Children trust completely," Essie said, stepping closer to the frozen men. "They believe what they're told. They follow where they're led." "Adults are harder," Bessie added, circling like a predator. "Adults question. Adults resist. Adults think they know better." "But in the end," Essie concluded, completing the triangle around the paralyzed men, "everyone learns to be quiet." The humming intensified. Phineas Colebrook, veteran of 2 wars and survivor of mountain winters that had killed stronger men, felt tears streak down his frozen face as his own grandson walked from the tree line toward the cabin. Thomas moved with the same eerie grace as the triplets, his young face empty of recognition, of love, of all that had once made him human. That night revealed that some battles are fought not with weapons but with will, and the triplets' will had been sharpened over 18 years of preparation. The humming continued until dawn, when 7 grown men were found kneeling in the snow around the cabin, weapons cast aside, eyes reflecting the same vacant stare as the marked children. Dr. Fairfax's final journal entry in increasingly erratic handwriting recorded events clinically even as his mind unraveled. The subjects demonstrated the ability to induce temporary cataleptic states through auditory stimulation and what could only be called mass hypnosis. The mechanism remained unclear, but the result was undeniable. The triplets had conquered without violence, converting the community's defenders into another set of marked followers. Bramble Hollow now belonged to Essie, Bessie, and Essie Ashbourne, and their 18th birthday, 5 days away, would mark not only legal independence, but full emergence into something the mountains had never known. What happens when 3 sisters who spent 18 years learning to command silence finally choose to speak? The answer would arrive under the December moon, when the triplets would speak their true names aloud and reshape Bramble Hollow into a place travelers would avoid for generations, if anyone survived to tell the tale. December 1st came with a silence so complete even the mountain wind seemed to pause, while the scent of wood smoke mixed with something sweeter, something that reminded the few remaining adults of birthday cakes, drifting from the Ashbourne cabin. Their 18th birthday marked more than adulthood. It completed an 18-year transformation. Helena Ashbourne had emerged from her Linham haze 3 days prior, moving through the cabin with a purpose unseen since the girls were small. She baked bread, swept floors, arranged wildflowers in mason jars with mechanical precision as though following instructions only she could hear. Mortimer watched, unease growing, recognizing the glassy obedience that had claimed the rest of the settlement. The marked children, now 21, had taken over the abandoned schoolhouse, sleeping on the floor in precise rows, sharing meals that appeared from unknown sources, and spending their days in silent contemplation that made the building feel more monastery than school. Dr. Fairfax's medical tools lay abandoned, scattered in a corner after he was marked 3 days earlier. His final coherent journal entry read, "The subjects have evolved beyond my ability to study them. I fear I am now the subject." Phineas Colebrook and the other men who had confronted the triplets now served as a living guard, standing motionless at the cabin's perimeter, regardless of weather or time. Their families had stopped trying to reach them after the first week. Understanding that the bodies remained, but the souls had been conscripted into something larger, only 5 adults remained unmarked in Bramble Hollow. Marcella Wesley, whose age seemed protective. Josiah Thornville, whose faith burned too bright to be extinguished. Mary Colebrook, whose maternal fury surpassed fear. Helena's sister Ruth, who arrived from the next hollow just days before the birthday and had yet to be claimed, and a traveling merchant, Silas Kane, unfortunate enough to arrive with a wagon of winter supplies just as the settlement reached its final transformation. They met secretly on December 2nd in the abandoned church, where Josiah's presence still offered sanctuary. The building felt cold despite the wood stove, and their whispered conversation echoed strangely in the empty pews where marked children once sat. "Tomorrow," Marcella said, "something will happen, something final. I feel it in my bones, like sensing coming weather." Ruth Bramblecroft nodded, her resemblance to Helena making her seem ghostly. "The girls asked me to bring something from the old country," she whispered. "A book from our grandmother, with pictures that made my skin crawl." "What kind of pictures?" Josiah asked cautiously. "Instructions," Ruth said. "Diagrams, symbols matching the marks on the children's shoulders. Our grandmother called it a teaching book, but she never taught what it taught." Mary Colebrook spoke from the back pew, voice raw from days of crying for children just out of reach. The merchant added, "I've seen similar things before. Not exactly this, but other communities where children went quiet, adults stopped making choices. It happened gradually over years. Eventually the people disappeared. Sometimes you saw traces, sometimes not. They stopped being human." The church grew colder as his words sank in. Outside snow began falling again. Through frosted windows, lights glowed in every window of the Ashbourne cabin. The birthday celebration had already started, whispers echoing in the darkness. Josiah Thornville stood slowly, his joints aching, and said, "I've been thinking about the old stories, the ones the Cherokee told before leaving these mountains, about places where the veil between worlds was thin, where spirits could take human form and live among the living, human lives until they reached full maturity." "Are you saying the girls aren't human?" Mary asked. "I'm saying maybe they started human, but became something else. Or perhaps they were always something else, only pretending to be human until they grew strong enough to stop pretending." Ruth reached into her coat and pulled out the book. She had mentioned a slim leather-bound volume that seemed to shift colors under the lamplight. The cover was etched with symbols that hurt the eyes to look at directly, designs that seemed to move if viewed from the corner of the eye. "Our grandmother said, this came from the old country, from people who knew things the church refused to acknowledge. Maybe it can tell us what we're really facing." Marcella opened the book carefully, her midwife hands steady despite fear. The pages were filled with writing in several languages, some recognizable as Latin, others entirely foreign, alongside detailed illustrations that made the small group gasp. Diagrams of human anatomy marked with strange symbols, instructions for procedures that appeared medical but felt deeply wrong, and on the final page, a drawing of 3 identical figures surrounding what looked like an altar, their hands raised to a full moon. "December 3rd, Marcella read aloud, voice trembling as she translated the Latin beneath the image. "The night of becoming, when the vessels reach maturity and the true work begins. Tomorrow would be December 3rd, the triplets' 18th birthday. Outside the church they could hear singing, not the eerie humming that had been their usual communication for months. These were real words in harmony, though not English, and the melody made their teeth ache. The marked children and adults had gathered around the Ashbourne cabin, forming circles within circles, all facing inward toward where the three sisters waited to claim their inheritance. What ancient power had been growing in Essie, Bessie, and DeCessie Ashbourne's bodies? And what would they become once childhood's last limits fell away? As midnight approached on their 18th birthday, Bramble Hollow would learn that some hungers could only be satisfied by consuming everything, the land, the people, and the boundary between the living and whatever realm had been waiting 18 years for 3 perfect vessels to open the door. The church bell began tolling at 11:47 p.m. on December the 2nd, though no human hand had touched the rope, its bronze voice beating a rhythm that matched no earthly timepiece. 13 strikes. Pause. 13 strikes. Pause. Counting down to something that had no name in any Christian tongue. The sound signaled that 18 years of preparation were about to bear terrible fruit, and the 5 unmarked souls left in Bramble Hollow faced a choice: witness the transformation or become part of it. Marcella Wesley clutched the ancient book to her chest, peering through the frost-covered church window. Outside, the entire settlement had arranged themselves in concentric circles around the Ashbourne cabin, their bodies moving in perfect sync, despite the icy wind that whipped snow across the mountainside. Children formed the inner ring, adults the outer, all humming the wordless melody that seemed to seep into the very stones of the church. "They're all there," Marcella whispered, huddled behind the pews. "Every soul we've lost, standing as if waiting for communion." Josiah Thornville joined her at the window, his breath fogging the glass as he studied the scene. The marked people were not dressed for December weather. Many wore only thin shirts or nightgowns, yet none showed any signs of cold. Steam rose from their bodies like incense, and their exposed skin glowed with a warmth that had nothing to do with human circulation. "Look at their shadows," he murmured. Through the swirling snow, the shadows moved strangely. Each person cast 3 distinct shadows, dark shapes reaching toward the cabin with fingers stretching far beyond what light should allow. Ruth Bramblecroft opened the ancient book again, fingers trembling as she turned to a page they had overlooked. The illustration showed a similar gathering, with figures arranged in circles around a central structure. The shadows in the drawing seemed to move, flowing like liquid darkness toward the center. "It's not just their minds," Ruth read from the Latin beneath the image. "The shadows are vessels, containers. Something has been living in the shadows, growing stronger with each marked person." The truth sank over them like soil on a grave. The triplets hadn't only been gathering followers, they had been harvesting shadows, collecting the dark reflections of human souls, and feeding them to something that had waited between light and darkness for 18 years. Every marked person carried a passenger. Mary Colebrook pressed her face against the window, seeking her son Thomas in the crowd. She found him in the second ring, his 12-year-old frame standing perfectly still, while his shadow writhed and twisted like a living thing trying to escape its owner's feet. "What's going to happen to them?" she asked, voice hollow. Silas Kane, the merchant who had witnessed similar horrors elsewhere, spoke from the darkness. "In other places, the people changed. Gradually, their shadows grew stronger while their bodies weakened until there wasn't much left to call human." The bell tower fell silent exactly at midnight. In the sudden quiet, they heard something else. A voice speaking in a language older than English, older than Latin, older than any tongue ever used for prayers or curses in these mountains. The voice came from all 3 triplets at once. harmonized into a sound that vibrated in the listener's bones, making the church walls creak like ship timbers in a storm. The true names were being spoken. Through the window, they watched the Ashbourne cabin's front door open. The triplets emerged, no longer dressed in simple mountain clothing. Each wore a glowing white dress and carried a curved knife that looked more like surgical tools than weapons. Marcella gasped, stepping back. The sisters' faces were shifting, becoming more symmetrical, more perfect, more beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. Their skin glowed like heated porcelain, and their eyes reflected the moonlight like mirrors, no longer brown but silver and depthless. "They're not human anymore," Josiah whispered, struggling to comprehend. They never were. They were incubating, using human forms until their real bodies were ready. The triplets raised their knives toward the full moon, and every shadow in the settlement moved independently from its owner. Dark shapes flowed across the snow like oil, converging on the cabin while the people remained motionless, their life force draining to feed whatever was being born that December night. Ancient hunger had awakened. The merchant grabbed Marcella's arm, pale with recognition. "We have to leave. Once the shadows finish feeding, once they complete their transformation, there won't be anywhere to hide." But escape was impossible. The shadows surrounded the church, rising like a dark tide, pressing against the windows, seeping under doors. The building's consecrated ground offered only temporary protection against something patient enough to wait 18 years and powerful enough to claim an entire settlement. Outside, the triplets began changing in ways the human mind could scarcely accept. Their white dresses melted into liquid moonlight, their bodies stretching upward, taller and more angular, proportions defying earthly geometry. What were Essie, Bessie, and DeCessie Ashbourne becoming? Would anyone survive to tell the tale beyond Bramble Hollow? As the shadows finished their feast, preparing to birth something that made Cherokee warnings of the mountains seem like bedtime stories, the remaining humans realized this was not a birthday celebration. It was the awakening of something that had slept between worlds, waiting for 3 perfect vessels. Screaming began at 12:07 a.m., not from human throats, but from the shadows themselves, tearing from their hosts and rushing toward the 3 figures that had once been the Ashbourne triplets. The metallic scent of blood filled the air. The snow beneath the marked people's feet turned black as their life essence drained into something that should never have been allowed to awaken. This was the harvest of 18 years of patient cultivation. Bramble Hollow learned what it truly meant to act as an incubation chamber for beings that existed between worlds. Marcella Wesley pressed herself against the far wall of the church, clutching the ancient book so tightly that the leather binding dug into her palms. Through the frost-lined windows, she watched as the triplets shed the last traces of humanity. Their forms stretched and bent, twisting into shapes that obeyed no earthly anatomy. Where Essie, Bessie, and Dessie had stood moments before, 3 towering figures now dominated the settlement. Beautiful in the way avalanches and lightning were beautiful, terrible in their flawless symmetry. "They're not sisters," Ruth Bramblecroft whispered, her voice barely audible over the shadowed screams echoing through the night. These were aspects, 3 parts of something never meant to exist in our world. The truth settled with the weight of falling stone. The triplets had never been separate individuals. They were fragments of a single consciousness that needed human vessels to anchor itself in reality. Helena's triple birth had not been a blessing or a curse, but a summoning, a calling forth of a presence too vast for one body, requiring 3 to contain it fully. Silas Kane pulled Mary Colebrook away from the window as one of the transformed beings turned its mirrored, brilliant gaze toward the church. "Don't let them see you," he hissed. Once their transformation was complete, they could sense thoughts, memories, everything that made a person unique. That's when the hunting truly began. But it was already too late to hide. The entity that had worn Essie's face for 18 years fixed its attention on the church, and suddenly the wooden walls seemed as transparent as glass. The 5 remaining humans felt their minds laid bare, their memories rifled through as if they were pages in an open book. Their deepest fears catalogued, stored for later. The thing spoke, not through sound, but directly in their minds. You witnessed the awakening. You carry knowledge of what we have become. This makes you valuable or dangerous. Bessie's consciousness added, icy as winter graves, the choice is yours. The third aspect slithered through their thoughts like snakes made of frost. Outside, the marked children and adults began collapsing one by one, their shadows completing their journey to the transformed triplets. Children crumpled first, their smaller life forces drained entirely, followed by adults whose bodies had been sustaining the parasitic shadows for weeks. Within minutes, snow around the cabin was littered with empty shells. Not corpses exactly, but hollowed-out husks, emptied so completely that death seemed too generous a word. 27 people reduced to discarded vessels. Josiah Thornville found his voice somewhere deep within his terror, his preacher's training asserting itself even as his faith fell apart. "What do you want from us?" he called, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent church. The answer came in visions projected directly into their minds. Other settlements, other communities, all serving as feeding grounds for entities like these. They saw towns where children disappeared first, followed by adults, leaving only empty houses and stories no one would fully believe. They witnessed the systematic harvesting of human consciousness, the cultivation of fear and despair that made souls easier to consume. But they also saw survivors, witnesses who escaped to warn others. The entities did not feed only on life force. They thrived on reputation, on the fear their stories created. Every tale told, every whisper, every family that fled at the first sign of strangeness. All of it seasoned the next harvest. Terror had its own flavor. Mary Colebrook broke from the group, pressing her face to the glass, searching desperately for her son Thomas. The small figure lying motionless in the snow bore no resemblance to the laughing boy who chased fireflies months before. Whatever had made him human had been consumed, leaving only a shell of flesh. "They're letting us live," she said flatly, not out of mercy, but because fear fed them. Every story the survivors told would ease their next hunt. Silas Kane nodded grimly, understanding the cycle. Every settlement that vanished had survivors left behind to spread warning, planting seeds of fear for future generations. He pulled a small leather journal from his coat, pages filled with notes on communities he had visited over the years. "See the pattern," he said, spreading the journal across a pew. "It's not random. They move in cycles, hitting isolated areas every 18 to 20 years, long enough for people to forget details, remember only fear." Marcella studied the pages, her practical midwife's mind working through the implications even as her heart broke for the children she had helped bring into the world. "The Cherokee knew," she said finally. "That's why they left these mountains, not because of settlers, but because of this. They saw the signs and took their people to safety. Outside, the 3 aspects moved among the empty husks, their impossible forms bending and flowing as they gathered what remained of the harvest. But Bramble Hollow was not finished. The transformation had stirred something in the mountain itself, a resonance that would attract other hungry entities sleeping deep in the earth. "You will leave before dawn," the collective consciousness told them, its mental voice carrying absolute authority. "You will tell what you have seen. You will prepare the next harvest." "And if we refuse?" Josiah asked, voice hollow, exhausted. The answer came in a single horrifying image. Ruth Bramblecroft's body joining the empty husks in the snow, her life force snuffed out as easily as a candle. Refusal meant death. Compliance meant condemning others. As dawn approached, the transformed triplets prepared for their next migration. The 5 survivors faced a choice that would haunt them forever: carry the warning to save others, or bury the secret and let the cycle continue. Gray, lifeless dawn revealed Bramble Hollow transformed into an unearthly landscape. Snow resembled bone dust, trees stood leafless despite early December, and 27 husks lay scattered around a cabin now slightly out of phase with reality. The metallic taste of drained life lingered, and silence pressed against the survivors with the weight of a grave. Their choice would define countless families' fates, unknown to them yet still threatened by Essie, Bessie, and Dessie Ashbourne. Marcella Wesley stood in the doorway, clutching the book that had revealed too much truth too late. The triplets were gone, leaving before sunrise to start their next harvest elsewhere, but their presence lingered in the mountain, a resonance that made every step feel like walking on the dead. "We could burn it all," Mary Colebrook said, voice hollow, staring at the husks that had been neighbors, friends, her own son. "Burn the cabin, burn the bodies, burn every trace." Silas shook his head. Others would come, travelers, surveyors, families searching for cheap land. They would find the ruins, ask questions, piece together stories. Without warning, more harvests would come. More empty settlements, more parents watching children transform into vessels for something that should never have existed. Josiah Thornville removed his clerical collar, letting it fall into the snow, a gesture shedding the last remnant of his faith. 37 years I've preached about good and evil, about God's plan and the devil's temptations. But this, he gestured toward the cabin, now empty, where beings had shed their human forms. This is something else entirely. It makes our theology look like children's stories. Ruth Bramblecroft opened the book one final time, studying its illustrations. "Our grandmother knew," she said softly. "Her grandmother before her. These things have moved through the world for centuries. This book isn't just a record. It's a warning, passed down through generations who understood some knowledge is too dangerous to forget." They made their decision as December 4th, 1853 dawned. Gathering what little they could carry, they left Bramble Hollow forever. The choice was unanimous, though it felt like volunteering for damnation. They would carry the warning, knowing every story would season fear for future harvests. But they also carried hope. Recognition might lead to resistance, and communities forewarned might survive. The burden of truth outweighed the guilt of complicity. In the following decades, the survivors spread across the eastern mountains, each delivering their portion of the warning to isolated communities that still remembered the lessons of past generations. Marcella returned to midwifery, watching newborns with wary eyes, alert for signs that some births were summonings, not blessings. Mary Colebrook moved to Tennessee, establishing networks of mountain women, passing warnings of silent children, and marked families through quilting circles and church gatherings. Josiah Thornville abandoned formal ministry, but continued traveling from settlement to settlement, preaching a new kind of vigilance. Stories about the importance of watching for signs that many communities preferred to turn a blind eye. Silas Kane had adjusted his merchant routes to include regular visits to the most isolated hollows, bringing news and warnings along with his trade goods. Ruth Bramblecroft became the guardian of the ancient book, carefully copying its pages and sharing fragments only with trusted families throughout the Appalachian Range. Their work created a loose network of watchers, families who understood that survival often meant leaving their homes at the first sign of children who grew unnaturally quiet, or adults who stopped asking questions. Over the decades, they prevented at least 7 harvests that might otherwise have succeeded. Communities that packed their belongings and fled when word traveled that the Silent Sisters were moving through the region became part of a long, quiet history of avoidance. Merchants brought tales of the sisters' eerie movements, but they could not save everyone. Some communities dismissed the warnings as old mountain superstition. Others hesitated too long and were already partially claimed by the time they recognized the signs. The entities themselves adapted, learning from each failed attempt, discovering new ways to identify and eliminate warning networks before they could spread their message. The cycle persisted, yet now it moved through a landscape that had been partially inoculated against its influence. Bramble Hollow's destruction had created something the entities hadn't expected, a generation of survivors who understood the signs and were willing to sacrifice comfort, peace, and safety to protect others. Vigilance came at a high cost. Bramble Hollow itself remained abandoned for nearly 70 years. Its ruins stood as a silent monument to the consequences of choosing ease over caution. Eventually, the state claimed the land for a forestry preserve, and new trees grew over the foundations where 27 people had lost everything that had once made them human. Yet rangers and hikers still report anomalies in that section of the mountains. Compasses spin erratically, cameras fail without explanation, and an oppressive silence hangs in places where children refuse to play. The entities that had worn the faces of the Ashbourne triplets were never seen again, though occasional reports surface every few decades of entire communities emptying overnight, leaving behind only baffled authorities and official reports that never fully make sense. The network of watchers persisted, passed down through generations who understood that some duties stretch far beyond a single lifespan. What would you do if the children in your community grew unnaturally silent? If neighbors you trusted suddenly ignored danger? If ordinary things, even the taste of meat, seemed too good to question? The survivors of Bramble Hollow had learned that the hardest choice was never between good and evil. It was between a comfortable lie and a truth that demanded action, between the safety of ignorance and the burden of witnessing horrors most people were unprepared to believe. But believing was never enough. Watching, recognizing, and acting while action still mattered, these were the tools handed down to the next generations. Tools designed to confront the same chilling decision faced on that December morning, when silence felt like complicity and speaking felt like damnation. Even today, local rangers in West Virginia report sightings of 3 young women hiking the mountain trails in identical white dresses. They always appear around December 3rd each year, always asking directions to the next settlement up the valley. The stories continue quietly, almost like warnings woven into the fabric of the mountains themselves. The deeper truth remains mostly hidden. The next chapter, the next case, is said to be even darker, waiting in the folds of isolated hollows and forgotten valleys. The legacy of Bramble Hollow is a reminder that survival is never passive. It is never enough to hope the danger will pass. Those who witnessed the events knew that sometimes the only choice that matters is the one between action and inaction, between protecting life and letting it drift into the void. Families taught their children to look for the signs, to heed the silent warnings, to leave at the first hint of unnatural quiet. And in this, the spirit of Bramble Hollow endured, not as a place, not as a memory, but as a living caution. The mountains, silent as ever, continue to watch, waiting for the next decision, the next brave or foolish soul who will confront the truth behind the quiet, behind the inexplicable. The watchers remain vigilant, moving unseen, ready to intervene where those who came before could no longer act. And somewhere, deep in the hollows, the stories of the triplets echo faintly, carried by wind through the pine-scented air, a reminder of what can happen when silence grows too powerful to resist. The tale of Bramble Hollow, of Essie, Bessie, and DeCessie, is not just history. It is a lesson, a map, a warning, and for those who pay attention, who remember, who act, It provides a chance to survive the darkness before it arrives.